on public land and available for people to watch them, and hopefully someday, maybe not too long, be able to hunt them.
You said you are biased towards Montana, but you, as an outsider looking in, Montana is kind of that pinnacle. It's where every Western hunter, every hunter would love to go hunt bighorn sheep.
A lot of these folks have just been hungry for us to find an opportunity like this. They've been waiting, I think 17 or I guess now 18 years.
All right, guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host again for this episode, Taryn Hunt. I've got a great podcast for you guys today. Before we get to the podcast, though, I want to send a shout out to our sponsors, Vortex Optics. If you haven't checked out their stuff, go on to vortexoptics.com. Check them out. They have a lot of new information. I mentioned this on another podcast, but they released a whole lot of new products early part of January this year. And actually be on the lookout. They've got a lot of really cool stuff coming out the rest of the year. I know for a lot of the Western hunters and really hunters in general, a lot of the stuff would be very useful. On today's podcast, I have Jay Kolbe of the Montana Fish Parks and Wildlife. He's an area wildlife biologist, and we talk about a bighorn introduction that they did up there in a new area. Now, we've done a podcast about bighorn introductions in the past in different areas, and it gets everybody excited. Bighorn sheep is one of those animals that really we all look forward to hunting at some point in our lives, and having more opportunities, more chances. Very cool opportunity for us, and a cool thing that they're doing there in Montana. So Jay shares that story with us. I hope you guys enjoy it. If you do, please like the podcast, share it around, and make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast on whatever podcast platform that you use. All right, guys, hope you enjoy. All right, everybody, welcome back to the eHunter Newscast. Doing a newscast this time on kind of a similar subject that we've done in the past. If you guys remember, recently we did a podcast about a bighorn release on Antelope Island in Utah. I know that everybody loved that podcast. We got a lot of feedback from it. Of course, everybody loves bighorns. So kind of on that similar note, today's podcast is also about bighorns and a new introduction, but this one is in Montana. And on the podcast with me today, I have Jay Kolbe. Jay is an area wildlife biologist for the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks there in Montana. Jay, how you doing today, man?
Hey, doing well. Thanks for having me.
Dude, I'm excited to have you. Like I said, bighorns are a big topic. People loved that podcast that we did about the introduction in Utah, and people love hunting in Montana. And so the thought of, more bighorns in Montana, just a cool opportunity. So I think a lot of people are going to be really excited about this podcast. But as always, before we jump into the nitty-gritty and the details of the introduction and things like that, Jay, would you mind taking a couple minutes and tell us a little bit about you, what you do there, kind of a little bit of your background?
You bet. Yep. I've been a wildlife researcher and manager here in Montana for about 25 years. I'm currently based in the little town of White Sulphur Springs in central Montana, kind of between Lewistown and Helena, and have responsibility for recommending management for 9 hunting districts in central Montana in the Little Belts, Big Belts, and Castle Mountains. Right now, just the general responsibility for game and non-game management for the state.
Gotcha. Very cool. Boy, so you've been a biologist for quite a while then.
Yeah, surprising. Yep.
It's amazing how time flies when you're having fun, isn't it?
It does, and it is fun.
Well, you and I talked the other day, and I told you. You were talking about flying for and counting elk, and I told you, I was a little jealous. You guys have a lot more fun in your job than I do in my day job. I'm pretty jealous.
There are some days, but yeah, we're really fortunate to be able to do what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's jump into it and talk about this. You were sending me pictures and videos, and I watched those videos and looked at those pictures for like a couple hours last night. I was showing my kids; they were just dying at of how you guys do this introduction of bighorns in a new area, and just a cool thing. In fact, I think I got one of my boys wanting to become a wildlife biologist when he gets older, because he thought that was the coolest thing, seeing you guys fly these bighorns in on with helicopters. But so let's talk about this and kind of get into the details in it. So kind of take us back to the start. Like, where did this idea come from? What made you guys think about doing this introduction?
Well, if you really want to go back to the start,
Yeah.
bighorn were common throughout the state of Montana in the late 1870s, 1880s. Areas including the Big Belts had large numbers of wild sheep, and then with the influx of domestic bands, unregulated hunting, some habitat degradation, we saw a pretty dramatic decline statewide, to where in Montana, sheep, by turn of the century, early 1900s, the sheep range in the state was restricted to just a handful of very small bands. And the department has been actively working to restore sheep for over 100 years. So in some ways, this project is just a continuation of that conservation and restoration legacy that the department has really made a commitment to for its entire existence. When you look at recent history, that we've really sort of been challenged to identify additional sites that are appropriate for new bighorn sheep herds in the state. In fact, it's been almost 20 years since the department has even attempted to establish a new bighorn sheep herd in the state. We've done some augmentations, done some other projects, but really it's been a long time since we've really tried to establish a self-sustaining and huntable bighorn sheep herd in historic habitat in Montana. Going back to 2010, the department drafted what we call the Montana Bighorn Sheep Conservation Strategy. It's basically our management plan for bighorn sheep in the state. And in that plan, we both committed to attempting to establish 5 new self-sustaining herds in the next 10 years. That would have been by last year. And we also identified the Little Belts in particular as really high quality but unoccupied bighorn sheep habitat. Now, we failed to fulfill that first commitment, not having established a new herd. There's reasons for that we could talk about. Bighorn sheep management is complicated, socially and biologically. But our commission continues to ask us to explore these kinds of restoration opportunities, and I've been working on that project for many years since. And finally this year, the data and the public support and the funding and the source, which is another important part of that, all kind of came together to allow us to proceed with this project. And so on December 17th, we did it.
Oh man, that is awesome. I got a couple questions that kind of came up as you were talking about that. Well, you talked about the Little Belts and that it was prime, good habitat for good location for bighorns. And as a wildlife biologist, what do you guys? You got to remember, I'm just a hunter. I don't look at the landscape the same way you guys do. So what are you guys looking at? Like what about that area that you're like, oh yeah, this is a good place for bighorns?
Yeah, you can start with the history and the anecdotal information, and there's real value in that. That's not to be discounted. And are you familiar with the writer and painter Charlie Russell, Western?
Yes, yeah, I am.
Artist. Yeah, it's real famous in this part of the country. They call this Charlie Russell country, the central Montana area. He, as a young man, when he first moved west, stayed at a cabin in the South Fork of the Judith River, the Little Belts, which is where we ultimately did the release last month. And in his journals, he wrote about the abundant wild sheep present in and around the area where he stayed those 2 winters. So we have some historic, records. And interestingly, we actually have prehistoric records. So right at the release site on some of the cliffy limestone outcrops where we release the sheep, there's actually bighorn sheep pictographs, Native American rock art, red ochre pictures of bighorn rams literally at the release site. So we know it was historically, occupied and arguably high quality habitat before those factors we talked about earlier caused their decline. So you start there, and then recently we've been able to use all that we've learned about bighorn sheep in Montana. We've had a lot of radio collars out and done a lot of research projects and funded a lot of research into bighorn sheep habitat use. And we've pulled together a couple predictive habitat models that describe a series of habitat variables that are clearly important to bighorn sheep. And we're able to overlay those predictive models on landscapes like the Little Belts to kind of confirm, hey, does what we know sheep need, does that exist here in sufficient quantities, and is it arranged in ways that we think could, again, support bighorn? And so we built a relatively new one working with partners at the university that describes winter range, summer range, transition areas that likely lead to that elevational migration, and lambing habitat, those steep, cliffy lambing areas that are also necessary to support sheep. And when I pulled that model into the Little Belts, several areas within the range, and this range is about 1.2 million acres. It's not a small mountain range. It's an island, but it's large. Several areas within that mountain range really popped, as having all of those habitat factors that you require to support, large numbers of sheep. Once you had those areas sort of highlighted, then you kind of move to the social factors that also need to come together to allow transplant like this to happen. You need to talk to the land management agencies. In this case, the Forest Service owns 900,000 acres of the Little Belts. They've been really, really supportive and had actually begun habitat improvement projects in the name of bighorn sheep before the sheep even arrived. So that's really, really proactive on their part. Need to talk to the neighboring landowners. Any release like this has the potential at least to be controversial, and we'll want to make sure that everybody's involved. We got very fortunate in the South Fork to have landowners that were 100% in support of wild sheep and went so far as to allow us to release the sheep on their property. So it's to have that landowner support is crucial. And then we went and met with the organization here in Montana Wool Growers Association, that represents domestic sheep producers, to explain kind of what we were thinking and to get their concerns and hopefully answer those concerns. And we did that over the spring and summer, and ultimately they encouraged us to put the project out for analysis and did not oppose the project as it was proposed. And that the wild sheep and domestic sheep producers, there have been places in Montana and other states where those two groups have been in conflict, and in this case we're not. We made some commitments on how we would monitor and manage these wild sheep, and committed to keep them entirely informed of how the project was going and to check back periodically. And so we've gathered that support. So you have the history of sheep presence, so the landscape historically did support them. You have new, pretty powerful habitat models that tell us that the habitat is still there. You got agency partners, and you have landowner and producer support. The fifth or sixth, I forget where my list is, the last piece of the puzzle is moving sheep is expensive. Those helicopters that your kids were watching, the number of people it takes in the field, and then we deployed some really fancy satellite GPS collars on every one of the sheep that we moved, and those are also very expensive. And so we approached some private funding partners who stepped up to help us actually fund the project, and also used, this year, the Montana, like some other states, offers a single governor's bighorn sheep license for auction. And this year that tag brought over $400,000. Montana's wild sheep are world renowned. The world record sheep comes from Montana. The area that we actually took the sheep from to do this reintroduction, those hunting districts are the hunting districts where these governor's tags are almost always used because of their trophy potential from that herd. But that money from that auction tag endows an account that's specifically intended to fund bighorn sheep research and conservation work. And so we were able to tap that fund to match some of the private monies that help support the project. So all those things came together in this case to allow us to get this off the ground.
Wow, it's amazing what goes into making this whole thing possible. I mean, that's amazing. Like you said, 5, 6, 7. I mean, there's probably 100 different things that had to come together, but those big main ones to come together like that to make this perfect storm to allow this to happen.
And if you allow me to add 8 and 9,
please.
I guess I should have thought it through. But when you're talking about bighorn sheep, you can't really talk about sheep conservation work, especially translocation work, without also talking about disease. I mean, that is the primary, consideration when you're either augmenting a herd or considering source for a translocation or reintroduction like this. That disease history and susceptibility is critical to test for and understand. The source herd that I was talking about, and again, I should back up for listeners not in Montana, the source that we used for this reintroduction is located in the Missouri River Breaks in north central Montana. That herd turns out to be one of the most productive herds in the state, almost too productive. It's difficult for us to maintain that herd at our objective level. And one of the things we've learned about bighorn sheep is that one of the potential preconditions or precursors to a respiratory disease outbreak is high herd density. So we strive to maintain herds around the state at our objective levels and not to allow the herd density to get beyond a point where it could potentially lead to a disease outbreak. This herd in the breaks, its engine is just running hot. I mean, the habitat's amazing. These sheep are just noticeably fat. The pregnancy rates are extremely high. They lamb almost a month earlier than other statewide herds. By every indication, they're the most biologically or demographically robust herds in the state. And it's difficult to effectively control that growth with ewe hunting. Some people urge us to do that. Just by the way the sheep are distributed during the hunting season, that's not a practical solution. And so we have a source for excess sheep. The challenge is that herd, it was established back in the 60s, but that herd carries, when you look at PCR or serology for that herd, and we test it fairly regularly, it actually carries the Pastorellas and the Mycoplasma ovipneumonia bacteria that in other herds leads to respiratory disease in all age die-offs. They have that disease history. You can see it in the serology of the animals, some of the serology of the animals that we test. That herd has never actually had a respiratory disease event, even though it has evidence of past exposure to the bugs that generally are present when you do have a pneumonia event. We think that's partly to do with the high quality habitat and the general good condition of the animals and the mycoplasma. You hear people shorten that to MOV. The folks that talk sheep will use that shorthand. It occurs at a low prevalence, but it's there. Because that sheep herd isn't clean necessarily, we can't use it to augment other existing herds. So you wouldn't want to take that risk of bringing in sheep that have some prevalence of these other respiratory bacteria and bring them into a herd to supplement an existing herd that's not either already exposed or recovering from a all-age die-off. And so we haven't always been able to take advantage of the growth and the productivity of that Missouri River Breaks herd, unless we could identify an area like the Little Belts where you're really just reintroducing a herd all at once. You don't have existing sheep that you could potentially contaminate. And and that's all those reasons. That's partly why it's been almost 20 years since we even attempted to establish a new herd. But the Little Belts being isolated, not being directly connected to other Bighorn sheep herds, being largely vacant, and in a fair proximity to the breaks, just came out as an ideal area to take sheep from the breaks and to use them as a founding herd in a new area.
Yeah, sounds like the stars had to align for everything to work out perfectly like this. But I mean, even if it does take 20 years.
Crossed. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you said you got these. That was one of the questions I had, was where you got them from. Because I'm not super familiar with Montana, so I appreciate you sharing that information. I don't know, a lot of our listeners, a lot of them are Colorado, Utah, so they may not be familiar with that as well. So thank you for that information. How old were these sheep that you took from the breaks?
Is a range. So we weren't selected for ewes. We didn't take lambs. And lambs by this point in the season are independent. They're able to survive on their own, so we're not worried about orphaning, but we didn't take lambs, sheep of the year. Mm-hmm. But adult ewes, we took what we could capture. But we did age them by horn annuli, so we had a range of ages from 1.5 to 10.5 in our sample, which is really interesting to have that broad range. But
that's huge.
That's you got to think that's good, because you have some mix of ages and hopefully long-term productivity even of the original cohort. We suspect they were almost all pregnant when we captured them. Given our history with that herd, the birth rate is really high there, and well above 90% of those herds. There's not a senescence that you might see in some other species, even with the older ewes. And then we got 45 adult ewes, and 5 young rams. And there's a couple of reasons to take the young ones. One, it's kind of social. If we grabbed a 190 class ram out of the breaks, the fellow that had that tag this year and had been waiting his whole life or paid $400,000 for it would probably not be too happy. But the younger rams tend to be more likely to associate with those ewe groups, less apt to just take off, a little more dependent on those ewes is the theory. And so bringing in those younger rams, we're fully capable of breeding come fall. We hope that they'd be more apt to stay, in the release area than some of the older rams. So for 2 reasons. Socially, it's just kind of a bad look to grab trophy class huntable animals.
Right.
In Montana, we require a ram to be 3/4 curl or better before it's even legal. And these are, 1 to 4-year-old rams are nowhere near that. So we grabbed 5 of those and 45 ewes, and that was took us a day and a half to get all the captures done and the sheep processed and loaded up. But on the afternoon of day 2, we were able to actually do the release.
That was so cool watching them too, running out of the trailer. I mean, it's like they knew exactly where they wanted to go and needed to go, and just like a
Well,
new
that's what
home.
it looked like, but it turned out they didn't.
Oh,
Um,
really?
it,
What
it's
happened?
it's really interesting. These collars. I guess we can talk about those at some
Yeah.
point. But the collars are very sophisticated, and they collect a couple locations, GPS quality locations every day, transmit those locations through the Iridium satellite system and down to my computer, and so I can theoretically monitor these sheep's locations in real time. Um,
Wow.
couple times a day. You don't always get a point for every animal every day, but it's pretty remarkable that we're able to monitor these sheep's movements in real time. Um, we were able to build in something called a geofence, program that into a collar. So it's basically a polygon where when a sheep leaves or enters that polygon, my cell phone buzzes and tells me that sheep number 660 is leaving the polygon. That gives me a prompt to go to the computer and look and check to see whether we've got a sheep that's really on the move, potentially into an area where it could fall into conflict. And that was one of the commitments we made to some of the domestic sheep producers, that we try to keep as close an eye on the extra range movements of these sheep as technology would allow. And so we've got that geofence capability built in, which is pretty exciting. I'll
Oh, that's
receive remote mortality reports if an animal is stationary for 8 hours or more. And luckily, we haven't gotten any more than one of those, and I can tell you what the deal is with that one. That was capture related.
that's amazing.
Um, so they're pretty sophisticated collars. They're very they're data intensive, and they're very expensive, which is why the partnerships we had with the Wild Sheep Foundation, Montana chapter of the Wild Sheep Foundation, they actually purchased those collars for us and just handed them to us, which is
Oh,
incredible.
kudos to you
That
guys.
yep, not just the funding, but the fact that they were willing to do the purchase itself
Yeah.
streamlined the project and allowed us to move fairly quickly, where if we were to have to do that internally, it takes more time. So we have these really sophisticated collars that allow us to track these animals. That's kind of a double-edged sword, because as the management biologist for that herd, you hover over your mouse, and they're on a 13-hour cycle, and when the next points are coming up, and you're just hoping that they continue to do what you would like them to do and don't take off and get into trouble.
Hmm.
Right at the release, they kind of scattered.
Yeah.
We let them go, and they really just kind of blew all over the place. Not a lot of them out of the ag away from the mountains. We did have a group of 6 that did that I was very concerned about. Went about 6-7 miles out, found a rock feature away from the mountains and sat down.
Oh my
Had
gosh.
another ewe that went almost 20 miles north and was leaving the mountain range right immediately after release. Both those, that initial group that went out onto the flats and that single ewe, both turned around and both returned to
Oh,
the release site
thank
and
goodness.
are almost exactly where we'd hoped they'd be. But
That's
normally, in years past, you just open the trailer and let sheep go and hope for the best,
yeah.
and we have this kind of double-edged sword where we have so much information about how they're moving, that when you do see what's a normal, exploratory movement, you get pretty nervous.
Yeah.
As a biologist, you're kind of worried that you'll have to intervene, and fortunately, they've, since the release, formed back into smaller bands of 2, 6, 8, 10 sheep in the habitat that we hope they'd be in. And so far, every one of those sheep is on public land. So we're really hopeful that over the winter, when their habitat use is more generally restricted just on winter range and leading into the lambing season, which could be as early as April,
Wow.
that they'll develop a local affinity to the habitat that we think is most appropriate for them, and that over time they'll develop a standard, elevational migratory pattern,
Mm-hmm.
and stay where they're, on public land and available for people to watch them, and hopefully someday, maybe not too long, able to hunt them.
That's a question I want to get to because obviously my audience are heavily hunters and so, but we can get to that in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
These collars, have you ever used anything? I've seen collars. I've handled these collars and been part of putting them on deer and things like that.
Yep.
Have you ever used collars this sophisticated?
I've used, yes, is the answer. So just an example, last winter, we actually used the same helicopter service that we used for the bighorn sheep to capture and collar 50 cow elk in kind of between the big belts and little belts. And we're actively monitoring those animals for a different reason. We're looking at availability of those elk during hunting season and ways we can more effectively manage harvest. And back in the day, I deployed earlier versions of these GPS collars on lynx and mountain lions and others. And the technology just keeps improving. So the ability to have a geofence, the ability to track in real time through the Iridium system, and importantly, the longevity of the collars. These collars that we deployed, even with all that capability, they're designed to last more. I'm guaranteed that they will last at least 5 years.
Holy smokes.
Where historically, even with just standard VHF beeping collars, you would be lucky to get anywhere near that longevity. So it's just really exciting. This first cohort will be able to track perfectly. We hope to have, healthy lamb production native to the little belts this spring. Of course, those animals will not be collared, but they'll still be associated for at least the first year with their collared ewes. So in the early stages of this project, we'll really be able to keep our eyes and fingers on this herd as it establishes. And I'd argue this first few years is the most important period to have that information.
Yeah, definitely. Well, like you said, it's kind of a double-edged sword because, like you said before, you open up the gates and ignorance is bliss. At that point,
exactly, that's a better way to put it. Yep,
yeah,
yep,
you
yep.
assume that they're doing good, and you spot check them, I guess, every once in a while, fly them and see where
Yep.
they're at. But then again, I don't know. I'm kind of a techie, and I think it'd be fun to be able to just track and see where they're at and what they're doing, and like you said, have that fence set up that if they go past that, you get an alert. And I don't know. I think that's pretty cool. So it's amazing what technology, even in all aspects, but to see technology coming into this realm, it's amazing. I love seeing it.
Well, and it helps us. It helps us in a number of ways. I mean, just the data that we collect, we'll be able, those habitat models that I mentioned earlier. I'll eventually be able to use the data. We'll end up with millions of point locations that are highly accurate. We'll be able to use that information to further refine the population models to make them even more powerful and applicable in habitats like central Montana, where we used statewide data to build them originally. And there's a fair diversity when you look between northwest Montana and the breaks, in habitat type. It's pretty different. So we'll be able to use that local data to build and refine and improve our understanding of bighorn sheep habitat use in areas like this. And the technology also, just the fact that we could track these so closely set some folks' minds at ease that we weren't just walking away, and that when we had an animal that was getting a little too close for comfort to people or domestic livestock, that we could potentially respond to that, go dart it and move it back or do whatever we had to do. Just the fact that we were able to keep tabs on these animals helped build local support. So, it has a lot of benefits, even though it has a lot of cost.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up the point that the Wild Sheep Foundation, the Montana chapter, was able to help with purchasing those and getting those to you guys, which is so cool. And I did want to take a minute and maybe, if you wouldn't mind, kind of recognizing some of the people that were involved in this project, because I mean, at the end of the day, these things can't happen without those people's support. Not even just funding, but there's the support, the manpower, the things that it takes to do a project like this. So would you mind sharing with us, like, who was involved out? I mean, along with the Wild Sheep Foundation.
Yep. The Wild Sheep Foundation has a national organization, so that's kind of known as the Wild Sheep Foundation. They have chapters all over the U.S. and Canada. They were the primary funding partner, as well as having a lot of their staff come out and actually help us in the field and testify for the project in front of the commission, help in a number of ways. They've just been a fantastic partner on this and a lot of other projects. The state chapter is very active. I'm biased, but I believe that Montana has the most important, bighorn sheep resource in the world. And the Montana chapter is a big part of that advocacy, and they've got a very active membership. They contributed a significant amount of money and time and personnel to it. Great Falls chapter of Safari Club International contributed. Montana Bowhunters Association contributed, both time and money. Kenetrek, the boot and apparel company, helped, as did the outdoor hunting apparel company Kuyu, who have supported other bighorn sheep restoration projects in other areas and in other states. So it's a really pretty diverse, group of organizations that came together. And like I said, we complemented those monies with proceeds from that sheep auction fund, and that's money internal to FWP, but earmarked specifically for this kind of work.
Oh, that's amazing, and shout out to everybody that was involved in this.
100%,
yeah.
100%. Great people, and a lot of these folks have just been hungry for us to find an opportunity like this.
Yeah.
They've been waiting, I think 17 or I guess now 18 years for us to propose and follow through with a project like this. And we're hoping that, this is going to teach us quite a bit. And as we look toward eastern Montana and some other areas around the state, that we can continue to do this kind of work.
Well, that's actually kind of my next question I kind of wanted to get into was, you're going to learn, like you said, you're going to learn so much from these with those callers that you have. I mean, you're just going to, I think the knowledge that's going to come out of this is going to benefit, well, and honestly, not even just Montana. I think anybody that's involved with bighorn sheep, this is probably going to benefit everybody. But, like with that information that you receive, do you guys have plans to do more of this in the future?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, our strategy, and, we, as an agency, speak in terms of management plans and strategies. I mean, that's our direction, but our strategy has long directed the department to look for and identify more restoration opportunities like this. A lot of it comes down to risk tolerance, and we've been fairly risk averse. We experienced some significant and widespread all-age die-off events in the early 2010s in western Montana, along the Rocky Mountain front, in the Elkhorn Mountains, and nobody likes to see that. It's horrible. I personally had to respond to a number of those, and it's just breaks your heart. And so, you have that in the back of your mind. I think we do as managers, wanting to ensure that, a new herd is put at least a risk as possible. I'm kind of of the opinion that you can be too risk intolerant and be paralyzed by that. There are domestic sheep surrounding Little Belt Mountains, not close, but they're around, and there's a non-zero chance that we could see commingling, and there's a non-zero chance that whether from that exposure or because the sheep already carry a lot of these pathogens with them when they came, that we could see a disease event in the Little Belts. But our argument was that it's an island range, that the sheep would not be naturally connected to other established bighorn sheep herds, and that the nearest other herd in the Big Belt Mountains, just adjacent to the Little Belts, also were founded by the same sheep that we used as a source for these, and would theoretically have the same disease history or the pathogen history. So we think the risk to other sheep in the state is low. Even if we had a disease event happen in the Little Belts, we don't expect that to happen, but if it did, we're not necessarily putting other established herds at risk.
Yeah.
And at some point, if you want to, Brian Solon, he's kind of the head of the Montana Wild Sheep Foundation, is fond of saying, we've done all the easy ones, all the natural, slam dunk sort of reintroduction sites have been tried, and we need to, look beyond those. And this project represents that, in my view, represents that first step toward going, to different areas that might have not been considered 15 years ago.
If you don't mind me asking, Jay, and you'll have to kind of forgive my ignorance on this, I kind of I'd actually like to get in the weeds a little bit on this. Why are sheep so susceptible to these diseases? I know most big game animals and animals, I guess, in general, are susceptible to several diseases, but it does seem like sheep are very highly susceptible to a lot of these diseases. What's the reason in that?
Well, I could speculate, and I don't want to do that. The disease ecology for bighorn sheep is its own specialty, and there's people that study it their whole lives that probably couldn't give you a satisfactory answer to that. There's a behavioral piece of it. The transmissibility is nose to nose with a lot of these respiratory pathogens, and that's sheep. That's what they do.
Yeah, they're always putting their faces against each other.
Yep. And a lot of the pathogens that have caused, that we've seen cause disease, we talk about 100 years is a long time, but in the evolution of a species, or even the evolution of resistance to novel diseases, I guess you could make a parallel to 2020. That's not very long. And so they haven't necessarily developed that natural defense or immunity against some of these respiratory pathogens, or the precursors like MOV that cause pathogens that are naturally occur in the respiratory tract to descend into the lungs and cause disease. So I couldn't say why sheep in particular, but sheep in particular are susceptible to these respiratory pathogens. It just is what it is, and we need to manage for that and account for that and accept that to the extent that we need to manage them.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate there's people like you that have the knowledge to do that, because again, you got to kind of forgive my ignorance on that, because I've never even thought about that, but trying to manage for, I'm sure managing for those diseases, especially in sheep, is extremely hard. But again, like I said, in other animals as well, I know you're involved with other animals as well, and so I know that's a big task of your guys's and big part of your job. So I've always just wondered that, because I've talked to a lot of people about sheep, and a lot of people have talked about how they're always susceptible to these respiratory diseases, and something you always got to be looking out for.
Well, and they're not. And that's part of. I'd say they're not always susceptible, which is what's really interesting. The source herd that we're using in this case is a good case study in that. And some folks like Professor Bob Garrett out of MSU down in Bozeman have done a lot of work and have made the argument that there are factors other than simply exposure to the pathogens that lead to the disease. That, a herd like the Breaks herd that has that disease exposure history, we can see it in the serology. We can detect those pathogens genetically in the sheep. They've been exposed, but they've not presented with that respiratory disease. And so you start to wonder, well, are there other precipitating factors? I'm sure there are.
There has to be.
That also need to be present in order for that disease to express itself once it's present. Things like, habitat quality, other stressors that you can imagine being on the landscape that might tip them over the edge, to cause these endemic pathogens to present as a fatal disease. That's why I'm really fascinated with the source that we've got. We've got one clean, quote unquote, clean herd in the state, which we're gonna use as a source for another augmentation this winter on Wild Horse Island in the middle of Flathead Lake. I mean, that's literally a several thousand acre island in the middle of the largest freshwater lake in Western North America. And, that's this perfect moat around that herd's habitat as you could engineer. And so those sheep don't have that disease history. But other than those sheep, there really aren't other sources that haven't at least been exposed. And, we'll just have to see whether, a change in habitat or other conditions triggers what is latent in this herd to express itself or not. But again, we thought it was well worth the risk in trying to establish this herd. And if it does happen, that's really unfortunate, but we'd also benefit from that lesson too.
Yeah, it's definitely worth the risk. Man, this is fascinating. This is absolutely. I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to this stuff, so this is really interesting to me. But I agree with you. Well worth the risk for this opportunity to expand, the herds, that population in Montana. Like you said, you are biased towards Montana, but you as an outsider looking in, Montana is kind of that pinnacle. It's where every Western hunter, every hunter would love to go hunt bighorn sheep. So it's awesome that you guys are doing this and just expanding those opportunities. And with that, I guess let's go back to your, we kind of talked about or touched on it earlier. What's the plan with these bighorns, and is there going to be that opportunity in the future to be able to hunt them at some point on the up there?
Yeah, but I've already got the first tag set aside for myself.
Did I get number two?
Absolutely. That would be the measure of success.
Yeah.
I hope that in my career, I'll be able to see that first ram license offered. I mean, that would be a tremendous success. So we currently have 49 bighorn in this herd. We'd expect, a high recruitment level. I don't know what predation is going to be like. I don't know what lamb survival is going to be like. We're going to work on that this summer. But typically, you'd see 30, 32 lambs per 100 ewes, recruited as yearlings into the population the following year. With 49, probably 44 of those are pregnant, so maybe 10 to 12 lambs, 60-40 ratio used to rams would be recruited in 2022. And, that would bring the overall number of ewes up by that 6 or 7, and they breed and it slowly progresses. Our goal is to have that herd reach roughly 125 animals. At that point, they're genetically and biologically self-sustaining. We've seen that in other places that's kind of a sweet spot. When we did our analysis of the little belts, just based on habitat carrying capacity, not on the social stuff, but on the habitat carrying capacity, it told us that we have the potential at least to support as many as 600 sheep in the little belts. I don't think we'll ever get to that point because of some of these other mitigating factors, but we've got lots of good habitat there. And if we can grow the herd to 100, 125 animals, there's going to be a harvestable surplus of rams available for hunters. I worked with a herd closer to Missoula, Montana, that was introduced back in the 80s, and by the late 90s and early 2000s, it was producing Boone and Crockett class rams. I mean, it can happen fairly quickly. It's like compound interest. The more, as the sheep herd grows, the more of those lambs survive and are recruited into the population. Yeah. So I'm hopeful that if things go well, we'll be able to offer that opportunity, in the midterm.
I would imagine every hunter that's listening to this podcast just got a smile on their face, because any more opportunity, especially in a state like Montana, to hunt bighorns, you can't help but smile. And and you're right on the habitat too. I've never been to the Little Belts, but some of the pictures that you were sending to me. I mean, even just looking at the picture, I'm like, yeah, that's bighorn right there. Like
Yeah,
that's perfect
yeah,
habitat for bighorn.
yeah. It could use some fire. It could use some work like the Forest Service is currently doing, with some
Hmm.
thinning, and it's way more forested now than it was historically, and that's
Hmm.
true, in a lot of places. But that's something we can work on over time, and
Yeah.
again, with partners and with agency cooperation, I think we can improve some of that habitat, even above what it is now. And what it is now is apparently um, sufficient. And, by our models, and the sheep are telling us the same thing. So I'm real hopeful that it's got that kind of potential. It's going to support a self-sustaining and, again, a huntable herd
Yeah.
um, over the long term. We certainly know we've got the genetic potential. I mean, like I said, the class of sheep, if you draw that once in a lifetime governor's tag, if you purchase that tag, you're going to the Missouri Breaks. That's where you're going to hunt.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm hoping that genetic potential and the overall herd health carries forward into this herd's long-term success.
And it is truly amazing. I'll have to tell my wife to break open her wallet and buy that tag at something. I'm just kidding. That's
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
real money
yeah.
for that tag.
It is, it
Oh
is,
my
it is. But
goodness. It's so
yeah,
cool that there are those opportunities and that you guys are doing things like this just to create. We're humble hunters and we just love more and more opportunities and happy to help in any way that we possibly can. But we love it when stuff like this goes on because a lot of this kind of stuff is out of our hands, both financially and just the manpower of it. And so when people come together like this, including you and your team, it really is inspiring and just gives us a lot more opportunity and a lot more hope for the future as hunters. So pretty cool. Um, Jay, was there anything that we didn't touch on about the release or about the capture or anything like that, about the whole just introduction process that you wanted to touch on?
not really. I just offer to listeners and folks that visit your site that if anybody has any specific questions or interest in the project, um, they can get a hold of me directly, and I'll share everything we know. I'm putting out maybe a quarterly project update that I'll email out to folks that are interested if they want to track progress and see how things are going. We're more than happy to share anything that we can about how it's come together and where it's going.
What's the best way to get in contact with you?
Uh, just either email me or give me a call. My contact information is right on the FWP website.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. And I appreciate you being willing to do that because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. Like I said, I've had podcasts similar to this, and people come to me with questions, and I kind of have to point them back in the direction of the people that know what they're talking about. So I appreciate you giving that information, and I also encourage anybody, even if you're not from Montana, maybe you're not a bighorn sheep hunter, but I mean these projects are really cool and really interesting, and so if you do have questions or you just want to follow up with the status of what's going on with this introduction, I encourage you to get on that and get those updates because it's super interesting. It's just a really cool opportunity, cool situation. So, well, Jay, I appreciate you taking some time with me today to talk about this. I appreciate what you guys are doing there. I know I'll speak for all hunters alike that we appreciate what all you wildlife biologists and managers do to keep our love and our passion alive. I know it's your guys' jobs, but what you guys do for us is very appreciated. And if there's any way that we can help, we'd be more than happy to help in any way that we possibly can.
Well, I sure appreciate it, and thanks again for your interest in this project. It's a lot of fun to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think about catching up? Maybe next year sometime or something, or maybe even a little bit before, and kind of get an update on how the herd's doing.
Absolutely, we'll know a lot more after we get through a full year. So to see how lamb production goes,
Uh-huh.
and how when summer green up happens, how these sheep explore their new area.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll know a lot more in a year than we know now, and I'm really hopeful that things will continue to progress as they have.
Let's plan on that then. I'll probably talk to you between now and then, anyways. But if not, let's ensure that we get in contact and yeah, after they've been there for a year and get an update on how the herd's doing. That'd be fun.
That'd be fun. Yep. Be sure and do that.
Okay, definitely will. All right, Jay. Well, I'll let you back to your day. I appreciate your time. Appreciate what you guys are doing. Let me know if I can help in any way. And for those listening, again, if you guys have any questions, reach out to Jay. You can reach out to myself if you have any questions that I can answer. I'd be happy to. I'll probably point you in Jay's way because he knows what he's talking about and I don't. So, Jay, I'll let you go and appreciate your time, man.
Hey, thanks for calling.
All right, talk to you later. All right, guys, thanks again for listening to the podcast. Appreciate all your support for eHunter, not only the podcast, but also the website. If you haven't checked out the website lately, remember to go to ehunter.com. That's EHUNTR.com. We're posting new articles pretty much daily about hunting news, how-tos, reviews, all things hunting. So appreciate you guys.